So I've been thinking about the body, its relationship to art, its representation in art, it's the sexuality that artists bring to work, and the difference between the nude and the naked. It's been a challenge to come to this piece of work and to find a way for myself to understand it and how it was made and what it meant. You know, when you think about what the artist is thinking when it's making the work and what it's come to represent to us, like this may seem, when you walk past it, a fairly innocuous sculpture, you know, representation, maybe even a schmaltzy representation of these kind of, you know, Greco-Roman myths and then these biblical theories. But then when you really think about the time period that he was working in, the kind of radical change, and then to continually be putting out images of women where they are just like languishing near the bath or, you know, discarding their robes and being viewed as these kind of doting, beautiful subjects. There's a whole other context there that's missing now for us. And maybe it's fine that it's missing for us, because we often experience a piece of work without knowing the backstory. But when you're in a museum, there's didactics, there's dates, you know, it is a place to learn all of that background information. There was a janitor in Salem who gave his life savings to the city of Salem and asked them to erect a monument in honor of pioneers. And he gave $24,000, and by the time they got around to buying the sculpture, they had $34,000 to buy something with. And they assembled a panel of people, of which included the Portland Art Museum director and Pietro Belushi, who at the time was on the board of the Portland Art Museum. And they both recommended purchasing this Renoir because they thought, Belushi is quoted as saying it's like one of the best sculptures made in the last 200 years. I don't know. And they thought it a really good value and an incredible piece for the museum to have. And so Salem went for it, and then there was massive outcry about it. So in your book, you have a lot of documentation about it, and grainy pictures that I found off the internet, just as they are, and some articles from Time magazine, which did a big piece on it, and that is how Victor Carter heard about it. So he's in Los Angeles, he's a businessman, and had fallen in love with art by visiting museums on his trips around the world, and decided to become a collector, and had purchased a Degas and a Renoir. And so when he heard about the story and heard that it was this fabulous deal, and acclaimed by Belushi and the Portland Art Museum director, who are quoted in Time magazine as saying, "I hope some rich collector will buy it." Ding ding. Victor Carter says, "I'm going to buy that piece." And then, of course, the people who stood up for the piece were the ones who got it. And I was thinking about that relationship between the collector and the museum and the city and the public, and what people want and what museums think the people want, and how far we've come in that conversation, and how much it's been influenced by audiences, how much the programming at museums is influenced by audiences, how much it's influenced by collectors. And then I started to think about where the artist was in all of this equation. Where was the conversation about what the piece meant, what it was about, what it represents? And in thinking about this particular sculpture, I was thinking of reading about the cloth. Venus is a Roman goddess that represents like love and power, and the Greek equivalent would be Aphrodite. And so there's representations throughout art history of the same story over and over again, and they differ very slightly from each other. In almost every representation of Venus, she has some sort of clothing. If you think of Botticelli, it's like sort of wrapped around her, and she's always thought of being modest. She's covering something up. She's kind of dainty. And here we have Renoir like just casting the cloth aside. She's standing there for everyone to see. She's not covering anything up, and she's also holding this apple. So somehow Renoir has blended, several mythologies together, including the story of Eve because she has the apple. So her guilt and her, wanton sexuality, her uncontrollable urges are there. Eve couldn't resist the apple because women are very simple and they're connected to nature, and they can't resist. They must follow it. They have no other way, and this is this example. And in reading about Renoir and his representation of women, which was, basically the last, years of his life, only women, only paintings of women, only sculptures of women, all of them described in the literature as having tiny heads and vacant eyes, something I also hadn't noticed. When you look at a Renoir painting or sculpture, you're thinking to yourself, oh, here's the idealized female form. But I've never really questioned what the idealized feminine form meant. I've thought, this is the representation of beauty and nature. But in Renoir's time period, for him, the reason that he was painting women is that they were blank subject matter. They were shells. They were tools for love and caring of children and cleaning the house and keeping quiet, but they were not, and they could represent this kind of closeness to nature and just inexplicable quality that men didn't have because they were burdened by the world and their own bodies. And he also is quoted as saying he didn't find, he found men's naked bodies grotesque, but women's naked bodies, represented the world, the beauty in the world. Towards the end of his life, he had rheumatoid arthritis, and he wasn't making anything. And he had several assistants who had then gone on to become famous painters and sculptors themselves, including a woman who was his model and Toulouse-Lautrec's model and many other artist models who then went on to be a painter herself. But here, this art museum actually has it correctly attributed because it says Pierre Renoir, French, 1841 to 1919, and Richard Guino, French, born Spain, 1890 to 1973. And Renoir's dealer and friends paired him with Guino because he was really looking for an assistant. It was very common in that time, as it is now, to have an assistant who would make your work for you in your hands. And they never really expected credit for this. This was, your apprenticeship. But Renoir and Guino had a very different relationship, and all of the kind of documentation that's been earthed up. It's been a battle that's been going, that started in 1919 when Renoir's dealer basically, they say airbrushed Guino out of history by marketing his late work, his late sculpture, as Renoir's own, and not attributing it to Guino as had been discussed between the two of them. Because by the time Renoir had died, the two of them are said to have been great collaborators. And that oftentimes Guino was the one who was making the sculptures, and that Renoir was still painting even as the paintbrush was falling out of his hands. And that relationship was really significant, and the families, remember it, but that this other artist has been sort of eradicated from view. I really do think that there's something to think about when you're looking at pieces in a museum that you don't immediately connect with, and what their kind of secret story is has become way more interesting to me than the immediate reaction I have.